Project Lawful aka Planecrash by Arwayne aka Eliezer Yudkowsky and Lintamande.
I'm sorry that the modifications have been necessary, that you've been rushed into them. I know how much you are paying to try to be able to think as clearly as possible here. I also have some maps for how this conversation can be more pleasant and will do my best.
There's a cultural gap we never did cross, and not all of that was the conspiracy, making sure that I never understood Cheliax correctly. A Dath Ilani woman would tell me not to use Splendor 25 to make a conversation nicer for her, and, depending on how cautious versus forgiving she was by her nature, might decide that she would not date a man who deployed Splendor 25 against a woman, even if he'd done so literally to save that multiverse. She just would not feel personally safe around him. Carissa's imaginary Keltham not a recommended strategy for coping with breakups. That's manipulating you, and I don't want to do that. Don't want to be the kind of person who does that. Don't really believe it's ever okay to be the kind of person who does that. Even if you've already crossed other lines, it's never okay to cross. I'm not reaching the condescending conclusion. You don't really understand what manipulation is and are okay with it because you fundamentally are failing to model it, but I'm confused.
Talking to someone who has a lot of splendor on you is giving yourself into their hands at least a little bit. But, well, two things. One is that many of the other decisions I've made in the last 2 days are also giving myself into your hands a lot more than that. And I don't see a difference between splendor and putting on your earring and swearing not to work against your plans and giving you wishes. Like, they all might be bad to the extent they let you achieve your goals at my expense, and good to the extent they make things better. I am guessing that to you, splendor feels different because it's more like modifying your priorities than constraining you. But I think that to me, at least, maybe to most people who haven't had Dath Ilani training, both of those end up modifying you. Everything modifies you. To be in someone's life is to change which parts of you grow and which get squished. And all you can do is choose people who bring out parts of you that you like. I suspect now that I say that there's a keeper art of not being altered by having done something you were selected to do randomly, being the same person as the version of you who wasn't selected to do it but would have. But it's not one of those I think I should be trying to pick up right now. I don't have enough of a self to defend. And the one true real conviction that I do have, that people who want to live should not be annihilated, I genuinely don't think you could talk me out of that with 50 splendor. 2 is that just like you can trade with Asmodeus if you're Abadar, you can just price in that he'll be trading adversarially, and so you can talk to someone who has splendor and just correct for the splendor. I like Abigail, and that's probably mostly the splendor, and I can in fact set it aside and kill her if that's strategic. I like Despater, and that's definitely the splendor, and I can set that aside if we think of some other way to reach a confidentiality agreement with Ericura where the fact of talking to her won't itself be suspicious. I believe myself broadly competent to correct for liking you and for you trying to be persuasive to me, and where I'm not perfect, I'm also not perfect at correcting for being mad at you or for hating you or for being scared of you, and hating you and being scared of you makes it harder to think, and so is worse.
He sits down and hugs his knees to himself, keeps his face where she can see it, though. Okay, that at least doesn't sound like you're doing the thing that everyone else in Golarion does, where you have your Golarion frame, and you can't imagine anything outside the Golarion frame, and everything I actually am is just an outrageous deliberate insult for being not what the Golarion frame calls for. Dath Ilani tries so hard to reach across the gap that exists between mind and mind. It's not literally all of our fiction, our science fiction, but so much of it is that. When two Dath Ilani with, let's say, a long-standing friendship, old alliance, not romantic couple, when they have a serious disagreement worth putting effort into, they put the effort into reaching across to one another that novels showed exemplary protagonists doing with literal aliens. Because that's what it takes for people to actually communicate with each other, and not the thing that Cheliax had, where both sides just pretend. Which, though the rest of Golarion doesn't know it, they have only very slightly less than Cheliax. I thought afterwards that the reason why I was able to relate to anybody in the conspiracy is that in trying so hard not to clue me in on what the world was like, in having to keep me contained, you had to meet me halfway. You had to actually stretch your hand back, across the huge effort I was making to reach out my own hand, which I did because I was Dathilani, and you did because you were making a desperate, extraordinary effort to keep the alien contained and needed to understand the alien and meet it on its own terms in order to deceive it, and which nobody else in Golarion has in fact made very much effort to do for me since. To them, their frame is just the way things are, should be, must be, and if I try to be halfway less insane, that's not very much of an effort worth reciprocating, because I should just not be insane at all, obviously. I'm glad that you are trying to do any of that now, even if it's to try to stop the multiverse from being annihilated, as your own utility function considers to be a bad thing. Accurately or not, before, you came across as not doing that anymore, and I thought it was because there was no more conspiracy, and you wouldn't try to meet the alien halfway. It was just under threat of the multiverse being destroyed, and not under threat of being tortured for failure. I mean, I get why, according to your held principles, according to your model of yourself, you care about the multiverse more. But I didn't. Trust that the real you, it doesn't matter. Even if it's only under threat of the multiverse being destroyed, I'm glad to be with the Carissa who also reaches back. Carissa's imaginary Keltham not a recommended strategy for coping with breakups. Doesn't need translating.
I think it wasn't just the conspiracy. I think I got put in charge of the conspiracy because I wanted to understand you so badly that I was better at it than anyone else.
Out of a maybe stupid effort to understand a past that's already past, was anyone else, trying for your job, incentivized to try to beat you at it? Was there anybody else trying to be an expert on Keltham? Would that have gotten them tortured by you, if you'd noticed them threatening you? Did you crush down any potential competitors?
It was my y'all's job at first. I know you didn't really know him, but he was a decent man. He was good at his job at the World Wound. I don't know if the official statistics are true, but I think we had substantially lower losses than average. But Project Lawful was too weird, too confusing, and required higher intelligence, probably. The first night we slept together, when I told you I wanted to see a priest, I went to him with a question about whether... My recall may not be perfect, but I think I was trying to ask whether, if I slept with you, as I wanted to, and then later you learned that you weren't unaware of subtle, chellish signals of people not wanting to sleep with you, you were just... The way things go in Golarion, not supposed to care, then you'd be furious with me for sleeping with you, even though I did want to. Because we couldn't lie about the fundamental fact that most people in Golarion have sex they don't want sometimes. It was obviously entangled with too many other things. And if we weren't going to lie to you about that, then it might be that we needed to tell you before anyone had sex with you. And he said to me that if I understood what I'd just asked, I'd have to be the one to figure out an answer. Because he did not understand what I'd just asked. And then after some further discussion had me ask a Barco and then told me I was in charge of trying to maximize the amount of time before you got fed up and left us. And that's how it ended up my job. And then later, in Agorian, he got tortured very badly for a mistake that he made that I still don't completely understand and was having a hard time exercising ambitious initiative about the project, visibly so. So I told him I wanted Project Lawful to not have torture beyond what was in Taldor, as an experiment to see if that let people think. And he didn't agree to do it, but he told me I could ask the Most High to put me in charge. So I did. No one especially tried to undermine me about that. They'd have been enormously rewarded if they could legitimately do better, of course, but it was obviously a very hard job, and it's not like the rewards weren't also very high for being my second in command. I wouldn't have crushed someone who looked like they could grow up to be genuinely better than me. That could have made us lose. I really didn't want us to lose, and I also don't like people who are under my command being weaker than they could be. That was why the low punishments rule. I thought maybe they'd grow like we needed them to. In hindsight, the rumor mill was probably doing a lot for me, and additionally, I think it was visible that Abigail Thrune had taken lots of personal interest in the project, and no sane person wants to come to her attention in the context of a project they might fuck up, not if they can avoid it. When I was being punished for your departure, there was a lot of angling to take over the project, but it was mostly a Barco and Avarisha gambling I wouldn't come back. I did torture them. not so much for trying to compete with me as for driving Asmodia to suicide. And I hurt Mayal very badly about that. It was horrible and stupid of me. He was always decent to me, and I don't actually know if the damage I did can be undone. But not during the project, not while you were there.
I am probably imagining this as being much, much worse for you than it actually was, but I have no idea how I could ask about that. What would be the interpersonal comparison metric of worseness? It makes you look better than what Ione Sala knew of the background story, before she left Cheliax, which was all she was allowed to tell me about. You doing those things, for those reasons.
It's possible I am wrong about my reasons. People get muddled enough to backfill their own history wrong. It's kind of terrifying. But I'm sure about the question I brought to Mayal that got me put in charge of the project, and about what I got promoted past him over. I don't think it was very awful for me. Almost everything I hate, looking back, is what I did, not what happened to me. With a couple exceptions, but they're the kind of thing that would have happened more if I hadn't been in charge of the project, if anything.
I have enough additional questions that I need to start writing them down to make sure I can believe they will not just eventually get lost. I am going to ask things that I would not have previously asked, and hope that my mind does not require a lot of emotion severance about knowing the answers as soon as I turn off Splendor 25. He takes a diary-like notebook from a bag of holding and a fancy magical quill, which is still not as good as a ballpoint pen, and writes, "What drove Asmodia to suicide? Are the others okay who haven't been mentioned, like Gregoria or Shalira or Corva? What did Abarco and Avarisha and Mayal do to get tortured? How was Abarco able to force you into sex if you were his boss?" Ione didn't know this, but said there were many possibilities. Dominant one Abigail punishing you for fucking up.
When I left the project, I didn't do a good enough job giving it continuity of orders, and also everyone was very uncertain how things were going to shake out without me, and Avarisha decided to make a play for being in charge if I didn't get back, or second in command if I did, and started needling Asmodia. They'd pulled practically all the high-quality security we'd enjoyed when we had you, and sent them to Nidal and replaced them mostly with people who they were maximally confident wouldn't defect on exposure to Illenism, which mostly meant people who just enjoyed being awful people, and who started going after Asmodia and the other girls thought of as loyal to me, in variously plausibly deniable or not even very plausibly deniable ways. And Asmodia was a heretic. And naive. She thought that they'd do what was in Cheliax's interests if she just kept pointing out how stupid it was for them not to. She tried to get Abarco and Mayol to make them stop, and then when it didn't work, she killed herself. No one thought she'd do that because hell is worse. But she died and gone to hell already, right? Back when Nidal attacked us. And she came back happier and healthier? She must have gone to the gardens because Ericura foresaw that I'd bargain for that. So she didn't have anything to fear. So she killed herself. At which point Abigail pulled me out of my punishment for failing with you, and I went back and I knew that Mylal and Subarax had allowed this deliberately because they thought it'd be good for me to terrorize some people into submission for once. The other students are all okay, I think. Pilar eventually stepped in and started protecting them with her Caden powers. Maritzol's helping her with training the new candidate Ilani. I own all their souls, and they'll get statued if they die. I notice myself being nervous about discussing Abarco because many possible ways that conversation could go will make me annoyed at you for things that are completely not at all your fault and are entirely my own.
My current understanding is that you got forced into breaking that promise and did not, deliberately court being forced to break it. If that understanding is unambiguously correct, we can pass on. Carissa's imaginary Keltham not a recommended strategy for coping with breakups. You don't have to talk about it if you don't want to. I'm trying to give you the thing most important to me to know at a higher level of abstraction to make it easier for you to not talk about it. I cannot actually do more than that to protect you while you haven't told me anything at all.
That's correct, yeah. We were running a test of whether it was possible to escape from the facilities and evade security. Because we wanted escaping with Keltham to be a possibility and weren't sure what it'd take for an escape to be credible. The seed of the plan that became Nefreti rescuing you. Security had orders to answer to Subarax for the day. It didn't even occur to me as a possible failure mode.
Accepted. I model you as explicitly not wanting to hear reassuring things I could say about Dath Ilani attitudes versus Galarian attitudes. You can poke back if that model is mistaken. I pause briefly so you can potentially poke back. Pause. Carissa's imaginary Keltham, not a recommended strategy for coping with breakups. Since you predicted you'll get annoyed if I say anything, I'm guessing all the things I have to say won't actually help. That being the obvious inference from what you said. But I'm checking because I want to say things, if they might help to hear.
Maybe you could say them, but just say them about Keltham attitudes instead of about Dath Ilan attitudes, because I kind of have a grudge against your home planet's way of doing ethics right this minute, but I do care what you think.
No. I realize I was the one who had responsibility for being able to say what Dath Ilan was about, but I am sad and bitter about what people here must think of Dath Ilan now, and a whole bright world they never saw, and imagine horrible things about because they've been tortured by Galarion to the point where they cannot imagine an alternative to it. It will not be good for me to accept that instruction. Are we still on crying in each other's presence terms? I'm keeping tears out of my eyes right now. Carissa's imaginary Keltham, not a recommended strategy for coping with breakups. I'm mad at Elias Abarco, and I wish it hadn't happened to you, and I hope you're okay, and I'm not mad at you about that, and the stuff Carmen said was right.
Okay, I think at some point I'm abusing the imaginary Keltham thing. I don't mind if you cry in front of me.
Okay. I'm not holding against you being forced into that particular thing, though it's part of a much huger pattern of things you got forced into that I can't split off from you because then there's nothing left. But that particular promise breaking, I'm not holding against you. If someday you want to know in more detail why, and what a beautiful sunlit world looks like and thinks like about issues like that, you can ask. Someday. Carissa's imaginary Keltham, not a recommended strategy for coping with breakups. I don't want bad things to happen to you. I wish I could have protected you. Elias Abarco sucks.
You could have brought anything out of Dath Ilan you wanted. To Golarion. You could have ended slavery if that was what Dath Ilan's ethics said to do, or made everyone rich, or ended all plagues and famines and wars. You could have made resurrection so cheap that every family could afford it for every child. You could have built whatever bright, sunlit world you wanted. The thing you decided to bring out of Dath Ilan to my world is death for everyone. It doesn't matter what else Dath Ilan has. That is what you chose to give us. She doesn't say it. It's not true or fair. It just feels true, and Keltham's right about how hard it is to stretch across the gulf, how much trying it takes, and she believes him that he's trying too. She nods.
I would not actually be okay with resurrecting Elias Abarco for reasons directed at inflicting suffering on him. But if that's something you'd otherwise do, if not for me, I can try to pay you to make up the difference.
Huh? No, I've tried not to be personally vindictive about it. What would that help? I own an option on his soul too, and I was planning to make him into the best devil I could. It wouldn't be fair to do anything less.
Carissa's imaginary Keltham, not a recommended strategy for coping with breakups. I think he might have been trying to say that that'd be an understandable way to feel, thing to want. That if you do want that, he wants you to at least have something equivalent in value, so that while he can't give you that, he can give you something you wanted as much as that.
I appreciate the offer, though.
Okay, I keep thinking that I don't know what kind of person you actually are, when half of you isn't being point-wise shaped by the threat of immediate torture, and half of you isn't an elaborate lie. And I keep thinking that it's not like I could actually ask, or you could tell me, because even fully half a day being out from under all of that is not enough time that you could reasonably figure out who you are.
There are bits I've figured out, not the whole thing, definitely. I think there are instincts I had all along and was ignoring, but they didn't go away and I can just stop ignoring them. And it's not like how I got here isn't part of the answer to who I am. I figured out I needed to overthrow Asmodeus if I wanted to fix hell, so I wrote a letter convincing Aspexia Rugaton to let me sell my soul, rescue all the project girls, and make things okay enough I could work with you to build civilization. Because I was pessimistic about doing it without you, and I, thought we probably couldn't work together if Asmodia and Paranza were being eternally tortured, and it was my fault. I think that's a decent starting description of who I am.
I was pretty explicitly not trying to be anyone after I got out of Cheliax. I'd lost all my girlfriends except Ione, who would have been third on my list for emotional support and not on my list for physical intimacy. found out that all my hard work up until that point had made Galarian worse, figured out that Cheliax was holding my prospective child, or children hostage, found out about the boneyard, found out about hell, didn't decide immediately to destroy Pharasma's creation, but I knew that if I couldn't think of a solution, I would have to do that. Didn't want, never wanted to hurt anyone. And at Splendor 25, I can, apparently, just bull rush through letting myself feel some of that, if not all of it. So I have spent a few hours curled up sort of blacking out and not doing anything, and then another few hours letting myself starting to feel some of the more bearable things. But it is still not clear to me yet that I want to be a person, here, or would benefit from being one, while I have to do the things I have to do.
I think I'm made pretty differently from you, but, trying not to feel things and just to do what I'd calculated was correct without letting myself catch up emotionally, and while scared to even think, worked really badly, in my case. It'd be a very unusual mind that worked better when half of it was out of commission.
I am not scared to think. I at no point during any of this decided to model the world incorrectly. It's what's wise to let myself feel, that's the question.
Scared to think is about the Caden Kylian stuff, but his reason for being scared to think about it makes perfect sense and aren't emotional in nature, and probably it'd be unhelpful to push further on it. Sorry. I really want you to recover yourself and feel things, but I think I am motivated in part by hoping if you do that, then you won't destroy the universe. I would still want it if it were magically stipulated not to affect the odds of destroying the universe, though.
When were you trying not to feel things and calculate and that worked out poorly? Like, all of your life in Cheliax, or?
Mostly no, actually. Mostly just when you left and we were trying to figure out project direction and, Aspexia Rugaton said if it took me killing 20,000 people to figure out how to make Alani, that'd be worth it. And I felt, probably what I felt was basically some part of me noticing that Asmodeanism is incompatible with even a tiny shard of human values. But I ignored it, obviously. And when I was hurting Malyal, I didn't want to, but I had all these good arguments for why I should. And actually, even by my priorities at the time, I shouldn't have. It's not that my feelings are a perfect guide. I also tortured some people and didn't feel bad about it. But the feelings were information about my values, and your values are a dangerous thing to be wrong about while you're trying to do something big and important.
I suppose. My values seem not ambiguous or complicated here, and my assessments didn't shift between before and after I augmented my intelligence. As I noticed after I asked the question, I asked it in part to deflect from you saying you wanted me to recover myself. I do not actually, even now, feel that there is very much point to that. It became clear, after I left Cheliax, that the sum of my issues would not let me be happy unless I walked away from all of them, and probably resorted to magical mind control to make myself not think about them. There comes a point beyond which you can't be happy, and there's no point in trying. So I took my augmented intelligence and started trying to roll my own pseudo-keeper skills, which obviously I am not getting right. Also, I suspect that headband wisdom is another thing that interfaces poorly with Dath Ilani, or at least the people here did not seem to know what I was talking about when I asked them if there were methods for handling the thing, where staring at your own emotions with +6. Wisdom makes the emotions go away. I would have put more relative effort into solving that sort of issue if I had not been trying to. Just speed ahead to where this is all over, and hope that somehow I'd be able to get back together with Carissa at the end of it, which wish, it seems, will also not be granted.
I noticed the impulse to say that if you don't destroy the world, I will absolutely and happily be yours forever. That sounds like the most doomed romantic relationship conceivable on every level, but it is not, in fact, false.
I assume you meant to say that about if I don't try to destroy the world at all, prohibiting also my trying to the point of Caden showing up and presenting an alternative to destroying the world.
I'm not sure. One basically reasonable thing a person could say is, I really like you, but I can't get over you trying to kill everyone. We can only be together if you don't try to kill everyone. But I think the thing I'm feeling is more, I want something Keltham really wants to live in the world where he doesn't kill everyone, regardless of how we ended up there, which is plausibly even more doomed. But it's closer to how I actually feel.
I didn't understand want something Keltham really wants.
Right now, it seems like you are very miserable. And even if the world doesn't end, there isn't anything that you care deeply about that you expect to get to enjoy in the world that continues existing and doesn't subject you to any personality death. And while I suppose this is a rude sort of assumption to make about someone, it feels possible that you wouldn't want to end the world if you expected to be really and deeply happy if the world kept on existing, or that you'd have a little more motivation somewhere deep inside you to come up with an alternative, or that you'd be a little more willing to compromise if you were getting most of what you wanted, but not all of it. That possibility makes me want to offer you anything I possibly can, if the world survives. Not conditional on you not trying to end it, just to say to you, if the world exists, we'll live in civilization and be happy, and I'll be yours forever. There's something worth living for here. I can imagine Carmen making such a face about this, but that's where I'm at.
Needs to involve people not being in hell, as that basically exists now. Better childcare in the boneyard, some protected landing areas in the abyss and maelstrom, and neither of us needing to be a god. Ironically enough, if we get an ending like that, it will imply further things about what happens to people like me after we die in plane crashes, such that in fact, destroying everybody in the multiverse would have probably sent them to pretty safe destinations on average.
2 of the items to argue on my items to argue list are: will technological development fix the boneyard situation anyway inside a century? And are the abyss and maelstrom actually bad enough to defensibly risk the multiverse over if hell is fixed? But I don't know if we're moving on to that conversation yet, or if there's more personal stuff to argue first.
I'm finding myself wanting to back up from what potentially sounds like a promise or an offer that we could be happy together under sufficiently optimistic circumstances, because I don't know whether you think you'd just actually be happy, or if you're offering to sign yourself back over to me and let me use mind control on you if I want you to be happy, or if it's the second thing, but actually that's just how your sexuality rolls. How much of that was reality?
I'd be really surprised if mind control was needed, but am not intending to say by any means short of mind control or something. If we have to use mind control to make it work, we can do that. She can see Carmen's face in front of her going, "Wow, no, let's back up." But she's not in fact going to retract that, not at all. Not if this in fact helps Keltham think about the world as something he might want to live in. I told you the truth about how my sexuality works. Except I think actually there's something about what you were doing which a Chelish person in your place would not have been doing, which was in fact an important ingredient of it being good for me, rather than just not hard for me to endure. And I do think that probably my not really having a sense of who I am as a person would play badly with belonging to someone else, but that solves itself inside a year. I'm not expecting to need that long to figure out who I am as a person. I want to travel the world. Read the histories in lots of different countries. Talk to people. Visit the outer planes, too. Talk to people there. Figure out which of them are ways a Carissa might turn out, and what I want to do about that.
Sounds nice. I ended up in an entirely different universe, and never got to explore very much of it at all. Not a lot of different scenery programmed in the game, apparently. There's an angry thing I need to get out of the way. Not about exploring, about the whole destroying the multiverse thing. Even if it's unwise, I think I should say it before we talk multiversal destruction, so it's not just running through my brain over and over.
Nod.
You were emotionally loud at me about how much you think it's not okay to destroy the multiverse. As I understand Galarian rules for political debate, I'm supposed to be loud back at you about people in hell who are too broken now, in too much pain, for them to pray to me, or anyone, for rescue. About infants who wake up in the boneyard and cry for their parents, and nobody comes for them until some feral older toddler bites off their hand, and then they heal because that's how the boneyard works, and they grow up like that too, and go to the abyss and then cease to exist locally, and, I hope, end up somewhere with good psychiatric rehabilitation. If I don't come with a good, persuasive, loud emotional response like that, then, as I understand the rules for Galarian discourse, I've lost the argument. Possibly the person who made an angry argument and didn't get an angry counter-argument feels that they've definitely won the debate. There, even if the other person is unreasonably not changing course, despite having lost so badly. I want you to imagine that you are the villain in control of everything, and that I am the protagonist who has to steer reality only by persuading you. Imagine that I, the protagonist, come in here being very emotionally loud at you about how dare you not destroy the multiverse when there's somebody on fire in Avernus right now, and it's maybe not too late to send them on to their next reality while there's still something left, if we work fast enough. Imagine that you don't say back anything at high voice volume and emotionally loud about the importance of people getting to live back at me. You just state that the importance of people getting to continue existing is the deciding factor according to your own utility function. What are you feeling when you decline to respond to my emotional loudness with more emotional loudness of your own?
If I imagine that person, I mostly feel sorry for them that they're missing so much, that there's so much human value it seems like they can't understand. But presumably I'd have a script for responding to this, if it comes up regularly, and that'd shape my feelings about it, like I'd know what response actually helped get through to people like that, or at least have guesses I was curious about. I guess I might be annoyed if they'd interrupted something important.
Right. Well, what I feel is something like, I am having to be the adult here. I am doing the emotional work here. While it might under other circumstances be searingly annoying that the other person might think they'd won the argument, having the deciding power would make up for that. So what I would actually be wondering about was why they were trying something so ineffective as being indignant at me, when I could not plausibly be persuaded by that, about this issue they seemed to feel was important. I would think they were probably just acting out their own emotions, by reflex. Saying that I would feel dismissive about it would not be wrong. I am not saying that you cannot have and express feelings about how much you don't want the multiverse destroyed, expressing them indignantly, at me, as if I shared your background assumptions and just needed to be shown the self-evident truth, acting out those emotions at me. It's not particularly likely to work on me. I make only that argument and no others, because I think it is the part that you, by your own principles, ought to care about. It won't work. It will hinder you in what you say is your purpose. The part I feel shouldness about, I suppose, is that two Dathilani, no matter how extreme the situation they were in, would never do that to each other. That's why they'd be able to continue, trading, working together, maybe even not hating each other, even if they had an unresolvable difference of utility. Clearly everybody in this planet ought to behave that way, the way I think they should behave. When the universe doesn't behave like that, it's doing so to personally hurt me, and I should yell at it, and you, in this case, are being the universe, so I am yelling.
I think I wouldn't find an argument at all less persuasive because it was emotional. Like, it were an argument we should destroy the world. It still wouldn't move me because that is really, really overdetermined as a horrible idea, but I wouldn't feel any differently about the person who came in to yell about it and the person who came in to calmly ask about it, and therefore wouldn't really be more confused about the emotional person than the calm one, except insofar as in Chellish terms being unable to conceal your emotions means you're weak and contemptible.
I have to say that if this was otherwise a nice planet that should absolutely not be destroyed, and some ill-advised people were doobling along doing something that would destroy it, like an ill-advised wish spell, and this wasn't even a values difference, such that they did share all my emotions and could theoretically be persuaded by those, I would still not just start screaming at them about all the people explicitly asking not to be killed, and all the children who didn't want to be killed, and all the waiting souls in cryonic suspension who'd trusted themselves to the future, and how so many people had happy lives that ought not be destroyed, and the future would be even more full of happy lives that shouldn't be destroyed. I would still, even in that case, expect that getting emotional at them would not actually work. Maybe this isn't the important thing and we should move on. I got to say the angry thing, you heard it, and if that's not enough, then too bad for me.
Perhaps that's a good idea, but I feel like some confusion remains, and I wish I understood it. If the person came in to yell angrily at me about the people in Avernus, and I thought they were a kind of strategic person in general, I'd assume they thought I was missing some deeply felt sense of what it was like to truly and acutely appreciate the harm of Avernus, and trying to convey it to me, in case I actually hadn't encountered anything that had given me a deeply felt sense of that. Or trying to help me notice that some intuition of mine applied to the situation which I hadn't been applying. This isn't what I was doing when I asked if you denominated internal spending in billions of murders enabled. That was just me hating you and wanting you to know it, because I was scared and miserable and would have been delighted if you'd lit me on fire for it. but it's what I'd expect the person was doing, and it'd sometimes work if they were right and not otherwise, just like other ways of trying to communicate.
So as much as you may not like to hear about it, I come from another planet which has 1,000 tons of extremely advanced cognitive technology for causing people with outlook differences to be able to work productively in the presence of those differences. This includes people with values differences, negotiating, and people with epistemic differences, making bets or figuring out experiments, and people in multi-agent cooperation defection dilemmas, knowing the conditions for mutual cooperation, and dividing the gains when two parties have to work together. It's all this technology that is designed incredibly carefully to work great when both people use it. Galarian doesn't, in fact, have its own, different version of this technology that works great so long as both people come from Galarian. It has people acting out their feelings at each other and yelling, and this does not, in fact, work. Hence Galarian. The reason why I don't yell angrily at the hypothetical people with a poorly phrased wish about to destroy Dathilan is that I don't think the locus of my disagreement with them lies within their failure to activate a latent emotion which I can activate by yelling my emotions at them. I think in this hypothetical example that they don't think their wish will destroy Dathilan, so yelling my emotions at them wouldn't help, even if yelling my emotions at them caused them to activate the corresponding emotions. That's more like you think you're trying to persuade an audience, but then first of all, the hypothetical audience, if this is Dathilan, also knows the key issue is just whether their wish destroys Dathilan or not. Second of all, in our case, there is no audience, or at least none that has power over our world, so far as we know, and is persuadable by arguments we understand. I have all these rules inside my head for what you are supposed to do about cases like this. And the thing is, in fact, my rules would work great if there were a world-destroying Dathilani and a world-preserving Dathilani who needed to negotiate about that and navigate related factual disagreements. Your rules, I am betting, would not work great between a world-destroying Carissa and a world-preserving Carissa. And while this doesn't make me right, because I don't have rules that work for myself, plus a Carissa, and that's the rules I would need, it does make me frustrated.
Do Dath Ilani not think that yelling emotions ever activates latent emotions, or just think that no one ever makes mistakes that can be fixed by causing emotional realizations? Or, I'm not sure this matters. I had actually noticed that it was not achieving my goals to express any of how I feel about your plan, and talked with Carmen about how to not do it, and I think I can have this conversation by Dath Ilan rules. And in fact, the Chelish way of doing this is for everyone to conceal all their feelings at all times. So it's entirely possible I'm too optimistic about approaches that don't require that, and they really don't actually work.
Dathilan doesn't require everyone to conceal their feelings at all times. It has ways of quoting feelings to make them information, instead of being emotional at people like it's a threat or a demand. You could say, I think the locus of our disagreement is that you're not feeling the right emotions about the people in Axis who'd end up isekai'd to 100 different places with who knows what average properties, and I want to talk about how terrified I am when I imagine them dying and being separated from each other, and maybe ending up in alternate universes, run by powers worse than Pharasma, who like them even less. And I could say, I think we disagree about what the distribution of metaversal powers would probably end up looking like. But this uses a bunch of knowledge you don't have and can learn much faster and debate more productively at INT 29. You could say, I think the locus of our disagreement is that you're just not visualizing the sheer blank horror of somebody suddenly existing less, even if that feels to them internally like they just pop into existence at the world wound. And I want to prompt you with some visualization exercises for activating that emotion, and I could reply, actually, I don't think I have that emotion. I'm sort of skeptical most Galarian natives have that emotion, so prompting me with visualization exercises may not help, but you are welcome to try.
I will try to say things those ways when it seems to me that that's the reason for distance between us.
I have, obviously, a model of our disagreement. Among the protocols we could be ad-libbing for this whole thing, if we wanted to try running it through relatively more informally before going full very serious people at each other, is that I try to write down your argument the way you'd put it, and write down where I think I disagree with it, and you write down my argument the way you think I'd put it, and write down where you think your loci of disagreement are, and then we compare notes. Then we fairly judge, because we are Ilani who can judge things fairly, how well the other person's argument sounded like what we'd say. And if one of us did much better, beyond the variance of noise, in predicting and imitating the other, they win argument prestige that they can cash in for things like, well, then my theory of our disagreement is also more likely to be correct, and I'd like you to pause and listen carefully to it. We could also just quickly talk it out in case we already know where we disagree, or can easily determine that by talking, and don't want to bother wagering and winning argument prestige.
Trying to describe the other person's position sounds sensible to me.
And then describe what we think our own disagreements with that are. All right, let's do this thing. I am going to use some primitive but surprisingly helpful Magitech to do mine, a fake computer that basically just pipes a keyboard to a printer, so my version is probably going to be longer and more detailed given equivalent time. You want longer to work to make up for that, or we just notice that'll be different and consciously compensate for the unfair advantage it induces?
I guess I'll take a bit longer, if that works for you.
If you wish to support this AI reading and others like it, please visit patreon.com/AskWhoCastsAI. Any help is appreciated. And thank you to executive producer John Doe 7776059.